Why do we have an electoral college, you ask? Well, the short answer is that the people who wrote the Constitution had no idea what they were doing when they devised a system for choosing a president. They actually didn't create the electoral college. Nobody called it a college until decades later. What they came up with was a system of electors. And the electors were this group of people who would be chosen at each presidential election, specially chosen at each presidential election to themselves choose the president. So the decision in deciding on a president wasn't left to voters, wasn't left to legislators, wasn't left to anybody but these electors. So here's how it came about. When the framers of the Constitution were coming up with the office of the president, they had to figure out, how are we going to choose this person? How are we going to choose this guy? It was a male world in those days. So how are we going to choose this guy? The obvious choices, the obvious alternatives for a system of government that was this hybrid of states and this new national government was to either let the states choose the president or let the national government choose the president. And each had its drawbacks. If the Constitution allowed the states to choose the president, then that would not give the same kind of national coherence that the whole Constitution project was about. The problem that the framers of the Constitution had with the existing government under the Articles of Confederation was the states had too much power. And so they weren't going to hand over the presidency to the states. They believed that this would probably hobble the new government as it had hobbled the old government. So they're not going to give it the states. And they really want to make a point that this new government is a government of itself. It's not simply a coalition of the states. This was a problem throughout the whole Constitutional Convention. It was a problem, in fact, for the first 80 years up through the Civil War. In some respects, it remains a problem today. So anyway, at the beginning, they fairly well ruled out that the states weren't going to directly choose the president. And even if the states had chosen the president, how in the world would they do that? How do the 13 states, how would the 13 states make decisions? Would there be votes within the states on candidates? How would the slates of candidates be arranged? It seemed as unmanageable as it was basically, it was as unmanageable as it was unwanted. So they didn't want it to happen. So the other choice was to let Congress choose the president. Congress was the part of the Constitution that the people who wrote the Constitution, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention, spent most of the time thinking about. And it's clear that they intended that Congress would drive the new national government. Congress is described in Article 1 of the Constitution, and the longest article, the most detailed. The presidency, the executive branch, is described only in Article 2, and it's much shorter. It's much sketchier. So Congress was where power in this new government was going to reside. So should Congress choose the president? Well, that didn't seem very advisable either, because as enamored as the delegates to the Constitutional Convention were of the power of this new government, they also recognized that a division of powers, a separation of powers, was a good idea. And they didn't want the president to be beholden to Congress. This had been the situation under the Articles of Confederation. And it was the situation in many of the states. So states had their own chief executives. Some were called governors, but others were called presidents. And the presidents were very often chosen by the legislature, which meant that they were creatures of the legislature. And so the delegates of the Constitutional Convention didn't want to do that. So what are they going to do? Well, they came up with something of a compromise. And the compromise was this system of electors. And the electors were going to be chosen by the states. Okay, so that's written into the Constitution. The states shall choose electors. And then the electors will get together and they will make a decision. So why the electors and how many electors? Well, the number of electors, it was relatively easy to come up with this answer. It would be simply the sum, well, the total number of members of Congress from each state. That would be that state's number of electors, which means 2 senators, 2 electors for each of the 2 senators, and then one elector for each member of the House of Representatives. So large states would have more electors, small states would have fewer. But there was a minimum sort of size that even the small states would have because of the fact that every state has 2 senators. So the minimum number of electors a state can have is 3. There's no maximum. States can get bigger and bigger, but that was the plan. So it would overrepresent the larger states, but not quite in proportion to, it would overrepresent the smaller states. It would overrepresent the smaller states because of the fact that as small as you could be, you would always get 3 electors. But it still was somewhat commensurate with population. And how would the electors be chosen? Well, that was going to be up to the states. So the Constitution says just the states can do it. And the states have done it in various ways at different times. Initially, many of the state legislatures chose the electors. Gradually, though, as America embraced democracy as an ideal, then voters in the states would choose electors. And we still have this electoral college, as the name came about. It was a compromise at the start. It was devised because nobody could figure out sort of how else to do it. And it also reflected 2 things that are worth reflecting on. One is that it was written at a time when democracy was not an ideal to most of the heavy thinkers in American politics. So most of the people at the Constitutional Convention did not believe that ordinary people could wisely exercise political power. And so they didn't want to make a direct popular vote. They didn't think that ordinary people could vote that way. And then there was the whole question of, well, the states were the ones who controlled who could vote. And so if one state had different rules, one state allowed a lot more people to vote, another state allowed a lot fewer people to vote, how would that be adjudicated? Nobody at that point had an idea that there would be some sort of national regulation of who could vote. At that time, it was left up to the states. So it was a solution that was written in a time of grave suspicion of democracy. As America emerged into a democracy, imperfectly over time, then this solution for an earlier time seemed to be less and less of a useful fit. But like very many things in politics, and for that matter in life, if it's there, it's really hard to remove. The second thing is that the Constitution was written in 1787, was written with no mind that it would be the blueprint for American politics for more than 2 centuries. The framers of the Constitution, they were hoping that they might get 20 years out of this Constitution. The Constitution they were working with, the Articles of Confederation, had only been ratified 6 years before, and it had been found wanting. So 20 years, that would have been a good run. And then let the future resolve the future's problems. The notion that this solution that they cobbled together in 1787 at a loss for anything better to do would still be the blueprint for choosing America's president in the 21st century almost certainly would have boggled their minds. So if the Electoral College today, we live in an age when nearly everybody pays at least lip service to democracy. It's one of those things that if the Electoral College did not already exist, no one today would invent it. But it does exist, and it still constrains the way we choose presidents.